Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform. My name is Olga Atamanova, and it's been 9 years of the war and almost 1 year of the full-scale invasion of the Russian aggressor in our homeland. And I want to traditionally thank the representatives of all the mass media who tell the world the truth about our fight for freedom. And today we will be talking about an important subject. We will talk about the narratives of Ukrainian victory, the vulnerabilities and capabilities. I want to introduce our speakers today. They are Dmytro Zolotukhin, founder of the Institute of Post-Information Society, former Deputy Minister of Information Policy of Ukraine, an expert on information warfare and competitive intelligence, and Valerii Pekar, co-founder of Nova Kraina Civic platform. So, Mr. Dmytro, I know that recently you gathered about 30 experts in the area of communication who worked on development or were involved in development of narratives you're presenting today. Our colleagues from Media Center were honored to get involved in this process. So in brief about the work on this development, and then we will proceed to the presentation of the narratives themselves. Thanks for joining, everybody. Thanks for joining here and online. The civil organization Institute of Post-Information Society is implementing a project supported by European Foundation for Democracy Support, and the goal is two subjects that we work on is implementation of the open source intelligence, the methods related to the work with the open data, the implementation of those methods in government work, how this data can be used, and another area of our work is the development of crisis communications. So it's communications with different target audiences of ours, including the Western, the so-called fact-based approach. When we gather facts, we gather data and information about some circumstances and phenomena in the world of misinformation and propaganda, in the world of war, and about the Russian Federation itself, what should be done to it further on, and then we communicate that information to those who take decisions important to us. So we hold a one of our events here at Ukrinform, and I want to thank Valerii Pekar for moderating that event, and he helped us formulate the tasks which we set in front of us. So I would like to say that it's his quotation that we were working on during our event, that we are in the first postmodern war in this world. What it means, in my opinion, in very close proximity, that there is a real war in the real world and there is a war in the virtual world. So talking about the war in virtual world, I will not talk about communication issues, but I usually include into my students in Kyiv Mohyla Academy, I say that Ukrainian war for independence, for freedom, that is going on against the Russian Federation, it has a soundtrack. Andriy Khlivnyuk, who joined a unit of National Petrol Police, he sang a song Chervona Kalina, which became our anthem within year 2022. Recently there was a song by Antitila band, The Fortress of Bakhmut. It became very popular, everybody heard it, and it means that in the information space the war is not only war of arms but the war of emotions, and this is the essence of the postmodern war, where information factors mean way less during certain moments than the events going on in reality. So the decisions taken by our Western partners are based on what the target audiences of the Western countries think about Ukraine, about Ukrainian war, those who articulate their demand to the politicians of the Western world. And our enemy is not quite catching up, but they're trying, and we may talk about this in the light of the yesterday's event in Luzhniki Stadium, which was opened with the song "I Am Russian," sung by Shaman, and there is a lot invested in this song. I follow this performer, how he's supported by the budget funds within the last 12 months. Obviously, that song was created for those investments, and it sounded after the Putin's address, New Year address to the Russians, when everybody raised their cups, and that song started sounding, and that singer, he goes along the front lines and he sings this song, "I Am Russian." So the utilization of memes is also present there. There are t-shirts popping up saying, "I passed my Russian exam for a C. I got C on my Russian exam." So our goal is achieved in the real world using the measures of information influence. There are 4 categories of topics that we discussed during the mapping on narratives of Ukrainian victory. So they are described in this slide. The acquisition of a necessary number of weapons for liberation of all the captured Ukrainian territories and coming into internationally recognized borders, and acquisition of a necessary amount of financial resources, including blocked Russian funds abroad, political resolutions on exclusion of Russian Federation from world political process, global political process. As you may know, today in the Wien, there will be one of these Wiener balls, which where the Austrian intelligentsia is invited to, and there is a fight around it to participate in that ball in that venue of Austrian Castle of Hofburg. There were special visas issued which are prohibited for issue to Russians. There was special visas issued to the deputies of Russian Duma, so they come there and communicate with their colleagues from the Party of Freedom of Austria, and then they could go to that ball and dance on the Ukrainians' bones during that ball. So one of our goals is the exclusion of Russia from OSCE in the same way as it happened with the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. That decision is already undertaken, and exclusion of Russian Federation from all the global economic processes. But we will talk about this later. But reorienting those processes at the subjects of Russian Federation without orienting them to Crimea, when we don't need any mediator such as Gazprom or Kremlin in trade of oil, for example. And it's impossible when Russia remains monolith. And we were talking about different target audiences, and the key target audience for us are those people who may help us achieve those goals that I mentioned. And obviously the key target audiences are the Western countries who can on our side to make that resolution on provision of resources like financial resources and weapons to us. And in this context, I would like to demonstrate it. We were talking a lot before our event about ChatGPT. Obviously, we will leave some questions unanswered, but I left these words for illustration. I will pass the microphone to Valerii Pekar, and he will talk about the manifest to the Western countries by Ukrainian intelligentsia. And talking with GPT chat, I asked him very simple question. Do you agree that the actions of Russian Federation against Ukraine are a war aggression and the only acceptable way for democratic society and Ukraine is the victory of Ukraine? And GPT chat was answering in a very convoluted way that everything is done by diplomatic negotiations. And I'm reading the same quotations in the same words in the interview of Mrs. Wyona Hill, who worked with different governments in the White House, including the government of Donald Trump. And she says now that we should aspire to negotiations with Russia and to achieve the success with in the diplomatic way. So ChatGPT studies based on the materials which end in the September last year. For me, it doesn't have enough knowledge. So for me, it's an illustration of how what our task looks like. We have to convince the Western world that Ukraine is capable of winning this war. We have an image of this victory. We may explain how this victory is advantageous, how it's logic, how it will be a logical end and convenient logical end of what's going on in Ukraine now. It will be a logical advantageous end to the Western world. So ChatGPT is just an illustration. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have such a stance. I just wanted to illustrate that it just exists in the Western world because ChatGPT just took such explanation from somewhere, and the goal of all of us who were gathered for that strategic session is to articulate arguments to change these states, to achieve a situation when Ukraine's victory is the only acceptable scenario. So the public narrative in Ukrainian information space now, to illustrate it, I used the picture of Mr. Danilov, and it seems very symbolic that this is him and what this is his and what became very mimetic in Ukrainian information space. It's very interesting when the politicians, their quotations are used for symbolizing of some phenomena of social communication. So what we're interested in is liberation of Crimea and Donbass and reestablishment of the 1991 borders, decolonization or restructuring of Russia. I encourage everybody to take such words as demounting very carefully, destruction, because for our Western partners, all those words, they have negative connotations, and we don't want to do anything negative for that is negatively perceived by our Western partners. We want to build something that would be acceptable and pleasant for everybody in the world, but without decolonization and restructuring of Russia, such future is impossible. And the third item we were discussing, that there is no peace without justice, and that's yet another aspect of discussion that is being brought up in all those discussions, because many representatives of the Western audience, they say you gotta pick whether you want justice or you want peace, because if you want peace, you need to find something in the middle, like it was said by one guy. And the Miss Matvichuk, who deals with human rights activities, she's a very good example of communicator who explains why without justice, without punishment of those guilty of war crimes, there is no peace. The achievement of sustainable, very good English word, sustainable. So sustainable continuous peace is impossible without justice. And the last thing is counter-terrorism, because obviously terrorism is a phenomena around which there is a lot of discussions now, because the European Parliament recognized Russia as the sponsor of terrorism. So if there is a sponsor of terrorism, there are those whom they sponsor, and there is a number of resolutions in the world taken in relation to Wagner. And today Mr. Budanov, the head of Ukrainian intelligence, he says that Wagner troops are one of the most efficient forces of Russian armed forces, and Mr. Emmanuel Macron declared, mentioned that he asked Putin whether Wagner troops are a part of armed forces, and Putin replied that no, they are but themselves, and he was like so surprised that I was lied to by Putin, and I'm a circumvented president of France, and in the fight for against terrorism, there is one clear articulation that there are no negotiations with terrorism. This statement exists in the American political agenda, and American government refused to apply the term terrorism against this organization. And there is a number of resolutions undertaken by Ukrainian parliament which are subject to discussion for me, but for me counterterrorism as the world evil, as the fight against the world evil, is clearly in the context of what we want to do with Russian Federation, who only wants violence. In this media field that we discussed, that there is a competitor. The competitors whom our Western partners in the Western Europe and United States unfortunately listen to. So who are those competitors? There are a number of groups. I used this picture of a Kingsman protagonist, the Rasputin image, the cinema image of Rasputin, an advisor to the Russian Tsar, who is depicted as if in comics he looks evil, and he dons just funny clothing of a cleric, and those are the advisors who influence the public decisions in Russia. But they are no public persons themselves. So I am seeing the following groups as those which influence the taking of decisions by the Western territories. So the first group is Khodorkovsky, Kasparov, Tamirov. They are the people who are considered to be experts in Russia, but who stay in the West all the time, and they're being asked what is going to happen to Russia next. And the address of Khodorkovsky in security conference it just discloses how he wants to see Russia in future. So the first item is the victory of Ukraine, because victory of Ukraine is the only interpretation of the future today. But then he says, don't do anything to Russian Federation. We will go there and we will implement the real federalization. We will implement democracy there. And behind the scenes, it's not his quote, but I think that what he actually says is bring us to Kremlin on top of the Abrams tank, and then we'll see what we can do. Another group which is not equal to the previous one is the adherents of Navalny and the Foundation of Countering Corruption. And Navalny said, well, that the territorial integrity of Ukraine should be reestablished. He didn't mention Crimea, but he said so. So his stance is just a consequence of a demand from European political audience, and the leaders of this group reacted to that demand. So there is also the Forum of Post-Russia, which happened in Brussels on the 31st of January, and the deputies of European Parliament were taking part in that forum. It showed certain picture of the future, which includes the sovereignty parade of the subject of Russian Federation, which will result from Ukrainian victory. So another organization is the League of Free Nations, which is on the same stance that Valerii will describe in details. And the dark horses are the people who are currently in Russia. They support what they call special military operations. They are pro-Putin, but they understand that they have no future with Putin. So as soon as there is some destabilization of the political processes, they will change. They will change in the air, and all those people that I listed, they may be either our situational allies, or in certain situations they may become our adversaries, because we have absolutely different opinions of what the future should look like. So back to the Western target audience, for me very interesting is the finding that we discussed during our strategic session. It's the word Zeitenwende used by Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, is being discussed extensively wide. And in our opinion, it's very interesting to ask the Europeans themselves what is Zeitenwende. Let's talk more about that. Let's talk more about this. So it's some boundary that we crossed. If you pronounce it, all those words, zeitgeist, Zeitenwende, there are many semantic conditions or so many semantic phenomena that are pivoting around time, the notion of time, because in Germans their time is linear. It's the resource that can be exhausted. So in order not to lose time, we have to achieve truth, peace, to continue business as usual. If we talk about Ukrainians, for us the time is cyclic. We understand, it's clear to us that if now we don't find a final solution to this matter of Ukrainian victory, in some period, maybe 5, 7, 30 years, we will get back to the same point of war with Russia. So we're not satisfied with that solution, and we have to understand we don't have to blame Germans for their approach to reality. We need to find arguments so that we can explain what's the difference in our approach to reality and their approach to reality. And another concept I would like to discuss is if Russian Federation will stop cease its existence in the shape, in the form it is existing now, the conditional war, the conditional evil in the world would disappear. So this North Atlantic Treaty, which is the fundamental of West's unity, it may be disputed as it happened in the first decade of the 20th century. Like, what does it exist for if there is nobody to fight with? So I don't know if the Western world would be able to live in a paradigm without absolute evil, which is embodied by Russia in this postmodern concept. And the fundamental characteristic of the Western audience is the fear. They fear the vacuum which may emerge on the territory where Russia now exists. There will be a vacuum of authority, vacuum of security, and this vacuum may be filled with people way less than Putin. This is for what, for example, Mr. Macron thinks. It may be filled by China or Muslim world or Turkish advances in those regions of Turan, the Muslim subjects of Russian Federation. So Germans and West Europeans, they have a need for existence of so-called Rusland as something that redeems their sins for initiating the First and Second World War. They need somebody to redeem their sins for all that damage they inflicted on the world. So they don't pay attention to Ukrainian sacrifice of 8 million citizens of Ukraine who were sacrificed during the World War II. And when we're in the negotiations with the tank, so you know this means that there will be German tanks going across Ukrainian territory, and they somehow don't understand that Ukrainian territory is Ukrainian. Somehow they see it still as Rusland. And we were discussing migration process that may intensify during the construction of Russian Federation, the reinforcement of regionalism, not only in Russian Federation but in Europe too, when there is atomization of societies, because such contradictions that exist between, for example, Hungary and Slovakia may become more profound, and they may demonstrate the processes of going from the center to the periphery, and our attempt of response to all those challenges, to spreading fear in Western audiences, is to attempt to convince them that Ukrainian victory is not only Ukrainian, it's at the same time German, French, British, American, and European. So Ukraine and Ukraine's victory is the epitome of the European idea. The European idea is something that is being discussed all the time. The European values, what is the European society built upon? So the victory of Ukraine will be the epitome of the righteousness of all Europeans. So when you started building your union of steel, is the confirmation of the fact that more than 50 years ago you've made the right decision, and now all those ideas you laid as fundamental, they show their capability to win. We have to convince them that their business as usual is still possible, but based on the new conditions, way better conditions, when it would be better when we eliminate the risks from that business as usual, those risks that existed in uncontrolled conditions with an uncontrolled partner such as Gazprom or Kremlin or Putin. So when we remove the risk component, business as usual is still possible, because gas is not getting anywhere, and oil is not getting anywhere, and Arctic space is not getting anywhere from where they are now. But if it's all can be worked with without Putin, Sechin, Gazprom, Patrushev, Russia, that would be way better business as usual than it is now. And obviously security questions that we may talk about the reinforcement of the borders. The Ukrainian borders will become the borders of European space. And regarding Russian audience, Russian vector, we have to realize that it will not split up by itself. Nothing happens by itself. In order to have the demounting, restructuring of Russia happen, we need demounters and restructurers, the managers who will guide that process. There are no good Russians because they don't pronounce the idea of demounting of Russia, or they work to counter it, to counter this idea. And obviously there are people like those somewhere. They exist in the information space, like for example League of the Free Nations. But for them to cease to be in the marginal space and become public, we need the West and European Union to realize that we have to have a bid, we have to have a competition. And in fact this movement already exists, and and Ukraine is a part of this movement, but it should be formalized. Obviously victory has a lot of parents, as Valerii Pekar mentioned during our event, and the more parents the Ukrainian victory has, the easier for us it will be to achieve it. And obviously to win this war, it's not only Ukrainians who can win this war, and not only Europeans. This war can be won by Ichkerians, Dagestans, Tatarstan, Bashkiria, Tuva, and others. Just a second, I apologize. All right, I will speed up a little bit. Dear friends, in year 2024, there will be elections in the following countries: European Parliament, United States, Russia, that Putin already announced of, and I think that when world enters into the cycle of pre-election campaigns, we are going to feel way more difficult, and those communications that I mentioned, we have to implement them right now. How it can be done, Valerii Pekar will tell us about that. Thank you. Well, looks like Russians are already greeting us. Well, they found out about that brilliant address by Dmytro, and they decided to greet him. Well, dear friends, I didn't want to say about how to send some specific messages to Western audiences. First of all, good morning. Thanks everybody for attending, because I thought that usually the floor is empty during events like this, and it's only in the news of the esteemed Ukrinform the right news that something like that happens. Well, I would like to stop at a couple of things. We can talk about decolonization, and we can watch for a very long time on the flames above Kremlin. So just a couple of key things. First, the world atmosphere needs the picture of the post-war world. Until there is no picture of the post-war world, the war cannot be over. It influences the current aid to Ukraine with diplomatic efforts, finance, and weapons. It influences the plans about accumulation of funds for renewal, recovery of Ukraine. It influences reparations, justice, everything. As long as there is no picture of the free world, the war will be on. And every day of the war is paid by the blood of Ukrainian fighters. It's a very concrete thing. The end of war at least one day before our victory, and we don't recognize any other options, will save a lot of lives. The end of the war with our victory 1 month before, 2 months before, is saving of lots and lots of Ukrainian lives. So the end of the war with our victory the soonest possible is number one priority, and for this we need the picture of the post-war world. So this is my first key message. Also, I would like to avail myself of opportunity to say a couple of words about the manifest of the free world. What I said about the picture of the post-war world, having realized that the West doesn't have this picture and they clearly recognize it, a group of Ukrainian intellectuals resorted to preparation of the document which would represent the opinion of Ukrainian society in this regard. The document, I think you may have seen it somewhere. If you have not, you may find it. The website is called sustainablepeacemanifesto.org, and it's called the Manifest of Sustainable Peace. It was put together by a team of intellectuals consisting of about 25 people. The team includes Olga Айвазовська, Андрій Дружків, Євген Вибовицький, Микола Говський, Ганна Гопко, Михайло Гончар, Ярослав Грицак, Ореста Дриль, Ігор Кливушко, Олександр Матвійчук, already mentioned today, Масій Наєм, Тарас Течки, Олександр Сашко, famous Ukrainian intellectual and civil actors, and a dozen more names who signed this document, including Ukrainian artists. And the idea of the manifesto was to demonstrate to the West and to the Ukrainian society and our allies in the West and our allies in the Russian Federation the picture of the post-war world. We understand that the reestablishment of the borders of 1991 is not the victory of Ukraine. According to the data of the analytics centers in the West, Russia needs 5 years or a little bit more to recover their military potential. So we may be sure, we may be confident that this another phase of the military invasion in 5 years will not commit the same mistakes they did during this phase. We don't want either the repeating of Russian-Ukrainian war as it happened in Chechnya, for example, in 3 years. We don't want our children to go to war in a generation. to go to war with Russia. What's our victory? To understand what our victory is, we need the classics of the strategy. Classic of the strategy Engelgard is the peace better than the previous one. So the reestablishment of 1991 borders is the same world, the same peace. So our victory is when Russia can threat Ukraine no more. This is the only Ukrainian victory. And obviously the victory of Ukrainian armed forces or in the battlefields will be a fundamental of such a victory, but it will not be enough. Such victory is ensured by the armed forces in the battlefields on one hand, and irreversible changes in Russia itself on the other hand. So that's going to be our victory, and this victory is described in the manifesto. I will not describe the document in full, but I encourage all the journalists, everybody who has access to our broadcast today on the 4th of March. On the 4th of March in Mistetsky, I invite everybody to Mistetsky Arsenal. The collective of authors will present this document and discuss it in full. I will just stop at structure of the document. The key message is peace and justice should be happening together. You cannot ensure peace sacrificing the justice and the other way around. So it's about justice and sustainable peace. Sustainable, as Dmytro already mentioned. The first section is justice. It includes 4 subsections: punishment for crimes. The document is quite motley. It has humanitarian, diplomatic, energy sections, political sections, and some science fiction. It's fantastic that it was prepared within such a short period by such an extensive collective. So there are 4 key sections: punishment for crimes, reparations, isolation and exclusion of Russia and decrease of its role in international organization. And 4th is more concrete items such as recognition of all documents which took effect in the occupied territories as nil and void, the return of the kidnapped children, the return of the cultural artifacts, and so on and so forth. So sustainable peace has 6 chapters: the membership of Ukraine in EU and NATO, the overcoming of stereotypes about Ukraine based on the Russian narratives in Western politics. I would like to pay your attention to the article of Artem Shaipov and Yulia Shaipova on the colonization of Western historic narratives, which was issued in the West and it was translated into Ukrainian. The 3rd chapter is decolonization and overcoming of totalitarianism in the Russian Federation itself. 4, humanitarian chapter, the decolonization of Russian policies. 5, denuclearization and disarmament. And 6, it's about the oil. You see that if oil autocracies have weight in the world, such wars will repeat. So total slogan, the general slogan is never again 2.0. It's never again. It's the slogan which ensured 70 years of sustainable peace in Western Europe. However, unfortunately, a big war in the Eastern Europe erupted, and we need another never again. And now we have to build the mechanism which ensures sustainable peace in Europe. So once again, I invite everybody to come to Mistetsky Arsenal on the 4th of March. Please get familiarized with the document, Sustainable Peace Manifesto, without dashes, without underlines, without dots. So sustainablepeacemanifesto.org. get familiarized with the document. It's pretty concise, about 20 pages, so it's targeted at three audiences. First of all, Western audience, which requires the picture of the post-war world and its invitation to dialogue. In fact, because if there is no document, there is nothing to talk about. There is a stance of Ukrainian civil society, and now the West may build the attitude to this policy. So it's too excessive. This is something absolutely unacceptable by Ukrainians. This is where we can bargain. So its invitation to the dialogue, it was presented in the Munich Security Conference a couple of days ago. It was approved of by European security elites. And second audience is the Ukrainian society. Ukrainian society should understand what our victory is, so no one gets frustrated, there is no disappointment, emotional breakdowns, and so on and so forth. Ukrainian society should understand the following war with Russia in 5 years or 25 years should not happen under no circumstances. It's absolutely unacceptable. And the third target audience is the forces of forces in Russian Federation who may be considered our allies. So if Dmytro lets me to switch to this slide, I would like to offer a different classification. There are 4 groups in Russia who like those groups from marginal enemies to marginal allies of ours. And it's important to find an article by Vakhtang Kibuladze, a Ukrainian philosophist. He says that Putin is the enemy of our present and Russian liberals are the enemies of our future. So our main enemy is Russian pseudo-liberal because they're the same imperial thinkers as Putin, because they create an illusion with the West that the business as usual is possible, that democracy is possible in Russia on the very next day after the death of Putin. So they are the biggest enemies of ours. They just want to replace Putin in his chair. So Khodorkovsky, Milov, Navalny and their company, they are our enemies because they cannot offer anything other than smaller war to Ukraine. The smaller enemies of ours are Putin's elites, as Kibuladze mentioned. We think that Putin is our biggest enemy, Putin and his clique, but in fact they are our smaller enemies because the elites are going to split when there will be some disintegration processes in Russia. And those people, they will become dishonest, they will be bad, however still temporary situational allies of Ukraine. And the third group is Russian radicals, our situational allies. Dmytro forgot to mention the Forum of People's Deputies of Russia. So those are the people who quote the chair of China, Mao Zedong, who said that the gun bores the power, and they say we can use a little bit of power to make things better. And lastly, our permanent allies are those forces in Russia who aspire to decolonization of Russia and reconstruction of the Russian space. We use those specific words because decolonization is one of the fundamental words in United Nations, and it's mentioned in a lot of documents, starting from the documents of the with the fundamental documents of United Nations. You may find this word everywhere as the ultimate aspiration of a lot of nations. Reconstruction is rather an American word, which means the order brought to the post-Russian space. And this word is used in American politology, for example, in creating order after the Civil War. So those are the 4 groups of our allies and enemies, and we send the signal to our loyal and temporary situational allies. The loyal ones are those who aspire to decolonization, the liberation movements, regional movements such as Ingria, mentioned already, and I hope that those who did not see oxymoron, probably they've seen Masania, the last episode, and it's a big victory of the Ingria movement now that all of Russia knows about them. So this is our third target audience for our manifesto. Why? It's very important. I will say the last couple of words. I will wrap up shortly. It's important to consolidate the position of Ukrainian state in terms of its strategy against Russia. There is no such strategy for the time being. We have a number of brilliant political and state leaders who once in a while they say very right, very beautiful things. You may read the addresses of the president, you may listen to the secretary of SNDC, our key minister, but you may be fond of them, but there is no strategy with regard to Russia, and our allies wait for this stance to emerge. The West waits for it. Our allies in the Russian Federation wait for it. The West says that we cannot articulate our stance when Ukrainian stance does not exist. So any stance which is not accepted by Ukrainian society, Ukrainian state, will not be accepted. So it's time for the Ukrainian state. When I say Ukrainian state, I mean all the bodies of Ukraine, all the Ukrainian authorities who define the strategic development of Ukraine. So it's time to define the strategy with regard to Russia, and when we articulate it, we should start implementing it together with our Western allies, and it will add more sharpness to the vision of who's the enemy, who's the friend in Russian Federation. We will see that Russian liberals are our enemies. Again, I will cite Kibuladze, that they are the enemies of our future. And our manifesto, the Manifesto for Sustainable Peace, which provides the picture of the post-war world in political, humanitarian, energy and other aspects, is in fact the encouragement of Ukrainian state. Like, let's consolidate the Ukrainian position, let's communicate it to the world, let's communicate it to our allies in the East, West and elsewhere, and we'll start implementing it in systemic way, because when we know what we want to achieve, it results in the proper building of the hierarchy of goals, approaches, and so on and so forth. Everybody knows about black swan notion, which was brought up by Nassim Taleb. I will remind you, it is the event, unexpected event, which changes the picture of reality. Talking in a mathematical language, it's an event the probability of which is underestimated and the influence of which is underestimated. I don't know if there are any mathematicians in this studio, but what Nassim Taleb says, it's a fat tale, something that we underestimate, but things that change a lot and we underestimate their probability. But what is a black swan for somebody is the project for someone else. If for somebody decolonization of Russia is a black swan, for us it should be a project with the hierarchy of goals, the terms, resources, and responsible persons. Only profound changes in Russian political space and territorial space, the liquidation of the last empire in humanity, will provide for sustainable peace for Ukraine forever, and peace for the Europe, sustainable peace for Europe and America, and opportunity for all of the world to focus on the biggest challenges of humanity. Unfortunately, we have a lot of things to do on this planet, better than to team the crazy dictators, and before we tame them, we cannot proceed to solution of those challenges that we face. The empire should be reconstructed. Ultimately, the peoples should become free. I encourage Ukrainians to empathize. We were oppressed for hundreds of years. We were Russified. We were culturally humiliated. The citizens of the second sword. We were subject to humiliating. We had the destroyed system of national traditions, and we were forced to go to wars on behalf of Russia. Should Ukraine have fallen before, Ukrainian troops would be assaulting Vilnius today with the Russian flags in their hands, and this is why they support us so much. And Ukrainian, Polish, and Lithuanian slogan was for your and our freedom. So as long as this empire still exists and they pump all the resources from themselves and they guide their people to wars, so this empire should be destroyed. Ukraine should receive justice and peace, and the world should get the solutions for their problems. Thank you. Dmytro, do you have anything to add? Well, it's the briefing that I don't want to interrupt for any single second. Dear colleagues, I see in this studio we have a lot of people who were taking part in development of those narratives. If you have any reflections or comments, please get involved. Good morning, the professor of the chair of global security of Kyiv, Taras Shevchenko University. It's an interesting document, very powerful intellectual product, and for what I understand, the main problem will be in delivering these to the state authorities, how to implement this document, how to add it to the government agenda. It's a challenge for us because a large number of intellectuals, the forces, were involved in creation of this document. And Mr. Pekar mentioned a lot of target audiences, Ukrainian society, Western society. Is this going to, if Ukrainian government will ever become a target audience for this document, so that it becomes a guide for them? Ms. Arena, thank you. Everybody who needed to read this document, they already read it. But the implementation of this strategy is a strategic decision taken by the top-level government officials jointly. So some process is underway there, apparently. We can see we can evidence it by the yesterday's address of the president. I follow all his addresses. Dmytro may say probably more about that, but we've heard some quotations, some statements which seem more drastic compared to his previous statements. I believe in advertibility of the necessity of implementation of this strategy against Russia, and it will be obvious to Ukrainian political elites soon. But the question is, what kind of strategy should it be? We have to think a couple of steps ahead. Anybody who played chess or Go or good strategic games with a branched tree of decisions, there are people who count, for example, those who count 7 steps ahead usually takes over those who count 3 steps ahead. And I want to add with the traditional joke about one Ukrainian who chopped the trees in the forest with the blunt axe. He needed log for urgently, but he had no time to sharpen his axe. So this is happened when this is what happens when you don't have a strategy. He got heated, obviously, but we don't know how much he chopped. So we need the strategic vision of what is gonna happen after the war. I will remind you, the world is not bipolar, it's multipolar, or like Giselle Borev said, there are countries which build their strategy many years ahead, like China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and many others. We were forced to become big players. We never dreamt about Ukraine being in the headlines. We didn't ask it from St. Nicholas. This dream about the powerful brand of the country, and we wished everybody to think Ukrainian. But again, be afraid of your dreams. We were delivered this present in a package which is very painful and destructive and bloody. And now that we're where we are, we have to respond to the challenges that we face. We have to understand that we are one of those countries, Ukraine, one of those countries whose vision will be laid fundamental to the post-war world. We don't have either institutional nor financial resources to take this place in the world, but we have intellectual resource for that. Thank you. Dear friends, if you have any more comments, please be encouraged. We've heard some fundamental things here today that we need to think through, and maybe it will be a record that we will be able to review again and again and cut it into quotations. I really appreciate this powerful conversation. Thank you. I would like to announce our next cooperation, our next collaboration with our colleagues. On this slide we will present, if we reach an agreement, I think we will present the report of the open source intelligence in civil and state activities. So we were talking about how to communicate to implement that work for the strategy. We need some fundamental data, and we will talk about how a state may benefit and get advantages using the technologies of work with the open data, which is a part of our project. And this is how we will systemically offer many multi-step solutions on this way. Thank you. Thank you, Valerii, Pekar, Dmytro Zolotukhin. Thank you, dear colleagues, for interest to this topic, and we continue working on our victory. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.